Welcome. This is Jim Vacca again. Welcome to my home, and I'm here to talk to you about comic books from the 1950s, Fredric Wertham, and all of the turmoil that was happening around that time. But so I'm glad you could be here to join me again. But as you come back to my home, I always have to remember that I want to make it looking good for you here. So I usually go out to Whole Foods, Alfalfa's, or any of those kinds of hip grocery stores. Maybe you have them around where you live. And when I like to do my cleaning and care for my collection, I make sure I get a spray bottle of Eco Power. It's good stuff here. There's like a little picture of the outdoors there and stuff, and it's a tough job cleaner that's non-toxic, made from oranges and lemons. It's 100% biodegradable. You can experience a new kind of natural cleaning here. You spray this on and then you scrub it clean, and there are no harsh additives or anything like that. I feel morally correct using Eco Power cleanser here that you can buy in Boulder here. And it's just wonderful. And then there's a little poem here by Chief Seattle on the back here. So it has everything that we folks in Boulder love to feel environmentally right on target here. And so this is the kind of stuff you can pick up in maybe your grocery store. But if you were the harried house husband back in the 1950s, you might have found this on your shelf. New, sensational, Atomite cleanser. It cleans and polishes and removes rust from plate metal. And there it is, a picture of the mushroom cloud ascending over your sink there as it has atomic-like action. Wow, this stuff must really clean pretty well. But Eco Power is made with lemons and harnesses the power of the sun. These are about 50 years apart in their creation and distribution, I imagine. But as I look at these things, these labels don't tell me so much what's inside here. They tell me what's outside there. They're not telling me what's inside this plastic bottle or this cardboard container here. They're telling me what's outside in the culture. And what was outside in the culture in the 1950s was, Atomite, the atomic testing that was going on above ground. And people would have sourced that image and knew what they were talking about there. This image of power is to oppose this image of power now. The labels, or the outside, told us what was in the culture, not necessarily in the product. And I believe the same thing is true about comic books from the 1950s. When we look at the covers of the comic books of the 1950s, and I'm going to show you some here in a little bit, they tell us a little bit what was happening in the culture, not so much what was happening within the stories of the pages of the comics. In fact, many kids would report they would buy a wonderful, comic cover kind of thing, something like, all top here, and it has, jungle girls wrestling, gorillas or whatever, and the stories never quite met the expectations of the covers that themselves. So the 1950s was this really very special time, and the one person who I believe is very symbolic of the 1950s was Dr. Fredric Wertham, author of Seduction of the Innocent. Now, when we go back to the 1950s, this post-war America, this birthing of the baby boom as it was, the United States was experiencing an unprecedented economic development, mobility in terms of the highways being built and all of those kinds of things. It was a time of great optimism and expectation. We were just like, the war was over, things were going well, people were living in the suburb, it was this wonderful, wonderful time. And yet it was juxtaposed to the apocalypse, Now the atomic bomb led us from metaphor to reality, that we could actually destroy ourselves, no longer just existed in fantasy. It now became fact, as we saw when the bombs exploded over Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So we have this time that holds this great tension, that here you have this wonderful prosperity and economic boom and things are going well, and it all could poof, end in a second. It could all be over with. And I think the person who tells us a little bit about that tension and that time is the author of this book, Seduction of the Innocent. And here it was a critique of comic books of the 1950s. Now, himself, Fredric Wertham, a psychiatrist who worked in Harlem at the Lafarge Clinic and set this up, was a person of great liberal-minded political sensibility. He spoke and wrote for the decision of Brown versus the Board of Education. He was friends with Thurgood Marshall and a variety of other luminaries at the time. And he writes this book where he claims that comic books are the cause of juvenile delinquency and at some point the downfall of American culture. He actually says that Hitler was an amateur compared to the publishing companies that were coming out with these smut of comic books. And here he is a little bit in profile, picture wonderful by Gordon Parks there, looking very serious and determined. But and here he is in parody on this cover of Crime Detective, where he is muzzled and taped up. And he saw himself as a champion for the voiceless children who he did serve in Harlem at his clinic. And maybe there is some due that we have to give to Dr. Wertham in reporting upon the comic books that came out during that time. Here is Black Cat Mystery, a pretty gruesome cover, hanging a witch, and here's another one. You know, comics distribution in the 50s was different than it is today. There were no specialty stores, so these kind of sat beside, you know, Donald Duck and Uncle Scrooge there, right in your neighborhood candy store or drugstore. Law, crime, particular one that was illustrated in Seduction of the Innocent there of someone who is hung and his eyes rolled back, and all of these different comics that tell us about this, as W.H. Auden called it, the age of anxiety, which was the 1950s. So here it is again, that the truth of the times is in the ephemera. And the truth, as Emily Dickinson says, tell the truth, but tell it slant. You know, don't approach it directly. The comic books were, in some ways, these left-handed appraisal of the culture, which people neglected or did not talk about. So hence, it was in the covers of comic books like Venus that did not shy away from giving you in four-color wonder the end of the world in staggering, you know, thing, or worrying about how Stalin is going to destroy America. The cover is telling us not what so much is in the book, as in these things, but what's happening about the fears and anxieties in the culture of 1950s. And maybe the false optimism that we had in our own strength at the time. I love this cover here and what it's saying here. When this new guided missile hits the Kremlin, those Ruskies will really have a hot time. In atomic war comics, of course, we were all worried about communism, and there it is, four-color, in your face, you know, that kids were dealing with, that sometimes maybe even the adults at the time were brushing under the carpet. Love this one from Atomic Comics. Here is this monster coming over this building looking to grab this guy, but if you look down in the corner, very, very down here, it says the Manhattan Project. Somebody was slipping in some cultural history there, maybe unbeknownst to their own publisher. Atomic war. Can this happen in America? My fears and anxieties weren't far from this too, as I grew up in the age of duck and cover and more atomic war comics, you know. Boy, those Ruskies will get it when we drop this bomb on the Kremlin. And in a way, these were dangerous rehearsals in a time that was filled with great tension. And I love this one here, The Doll of Death in Beware Comics. And there's kind of like the shrunken head over a little atoll that's being bombed as well, too. They tell me a little bit about not just personal history, but the history of the times. And the one who did this, you know, who bridged this sense of both anxiety and angst and innocence in wanting to preserve this was Fredric Wertham himself. Here he is, this person of great humane sensibility and political care, and I believe real integrity about his desire to want to help and serve children from a psychological vantage. And yet he vilified all comics. In a sense, he was divided himself. You know, he had a desire, I believe, for the spotlight. And in his kind of pursuit of the evil of comic books, he went too far, I believe, in vilifying all comic books. And he wasn't, I guess, a careful reader. Yes, there were definitely excesses, but there were some masterworks of creativity, which you're going to learn about as this course continues too. He himself was a divided person. You know, and I think even divided in his own sensibilities of, you know, going into Harlem to work, yet living in Gramercy Park, a gated community in New York City at the time. And maybe in a sense, you know, we're all divided. Our personal histories and our culture divide us. We live in complex times, and the comic books stand again as ephemeral witness to these complexities. And I think that's why I love them. They don't shy away from these gruesome moments or these difficult times within our countries. Yes, Wertham has been vilified, but I think maybe a little bit unjustly, because I think in essence what he's trying to do is to help us hold that tension between the optimism that we have in American culture and yet the reality of the times that can bring us to the brink, as we almost came to nuclear war and so on. Yes, comics were excessive at that time and maybe did need some regulation, which is different than censorship, and maybe Wertham was correct in pointing that out. But in amassing them all together and placing them all together, he gives us a look into the fear and anxiety and the tensions of the 50s, if now we can begin to, you know, see that from apart. I find him as a person, you know, yearning for the spotlight, and I have this Circle of Guilt written by Fredric Wertham, and in a subtle irony here, it's an inscribed copy, and it says, "For Burgess Meredith, who I hope will play the psychiatrist in a Circle of Guilt movie, Fredric Wertham." Interestingly enough, Burgess Meredith did not go on to play Dr. Fredric Wertham in the movies, but he did go on to play the Penguin in the '66 revival television Batman series. The times were complicated then. But the times are complicated now, and comic books help us navigate those times with interesting stories, wonderful insight, and a rich narrative structure that give us the opportunity to critique the time and place that we live. Thank you so much.